from the lucid fringe. Ravings from the lucid fringe. Musings from an unpasteurized life. Improvised on the front line of love and beauty. Welcome, I'm Semeric Yarrow. This week on Ravings from the Lucid Fringe, episode 53, Portugalicia Pilgrims. Expedition to Atlantica Part 3, an omnibus edition. Lusophone Loitering, a Portuguese interlude. We're on a tram with antique wooden fittings circling the old Moorish quarter and heading to a big square where there are lots of Africans sitting on benches, laughing and chatting in easy Portuguese. Here we'll jump on one of the 4 primary coloured metro lines to pick up our belongings. It's early afternoon in Lisbon, where we're so far west that I will only get further west many weeks later on the remotest coastline of Ireland. My watch has gone back 1 hour, so the sunset won't take quite as long as it could have done, but the evenings are still long. I recognise the words on the signs, but am feeling pleasantly confused and scattered here, where the main language is not one I'm expert in. Still, it's one I've heard frequently in Africa, is not unrelated to the one next door, where I've just been, and I will have a ham-fisted go at speaking it myself at times. Today, however, began with a reunion in Lisbon airport, where my daughter Zoria has arrived in Europe for the first time since she was a little girl, and in a new country neither of us have been to before. So I'm seeing many things through the eyes of youth. Beginning with her impressions at breakfast, which we took on the deck of a classic bar, served on a tiered platter by somebody we assume is Brazilian but might be Angolan or Mozambican or from some other former colony that retains the Portuguese language and is transforming modern Portugal. For this country that was poor and on the edge of Europe is becoming dynamic and international, if still distinctly Lusophone. That's the term for Portuguese-speaking peoples. And with fairly flexible laws on citizenship and residency for those from former colonies, we're in a noticeably cosmopolitan city. The manager of our hostelry corrects my inadvertent Spanish. There might not be as many Portuguese on this peninsula, but they have their own distinctive world-changing history. A few weeks earlier, my Angolan housemate in Cape Town had become enthusiastic knowing we were coming here. Her own family has property a little further along the Atlantic coast. We wander into a bookshop, one of the largest in the capital. A moment a little like one I had in Madrid, taking in quite how much stuff is written in Portuguese, and I don't really know where to begin. To be honest, as we're only here for 5 days, I don't think my Portuguese is really going to get up to speed enough for a book to be worthwhile, with the exception of a pocket dictionary. Of course, in southern Africa we're pretty used to seeing the language, as all major international packaged items come in English, Portuguese and sometimes French, the 3 most popular languages in our region. I've had many Portuguese-speaking neighbours over the years, for the connections are strong. I played with Mozambican musicians frequently in my years on the Cape music scene, and often with a lovely Angolan guitarist. I've visited plenty of Portuguese shops and eaten southern African approximations of Portuguese food, often with peri-peri sauce, for the Portuguese are not as spice-shy as their Spanish neighbours. The famous South African fast food version is Nando's, who've expanded into the English-speaking world, but which I mostly know because of their witty adverts. I've had many plans to visit Mozambique or even Angola that have come to nothing so far, but which I'm definitely going to action one of these days. Zoria has already been to Angola, though just for a few hours to await her connection north, as Angola's Targ Airlines is proving a popular route, especially if you want to reach other Lusophone places. We head off to visit the Design Museum on our way along the street to the Grand Arch on the Rua Augusta. A blast of first world 20th century design and relationships to traditional Portuguese cultural forms. Those azulejos, mostly blue and white tiles, which I saw at an industrial scale in Seville, are the famous Iberian contribution to Art Deco design and indeed many other styles. There are, however, none here. There's already so many tiles in this city, and indeed this country, to be seen elsewhere, including in their own museum. So it prefers to get right up to date, with local YouTube pop stars aiming to incorporate dress and song and lyrics from the past into something of the present, as well as a retrospective look at Vivienne Westwood's work, the English haute couture designer who was part of launching punk. It's a blast and another way for us to acclimatise together to this continent. More Portuguese, of course, are the pastéis de nata, a little like Afrikaans milk tart, but rather more crumbly and with a thicker consistency. We make a commitment to have at least one of these a day while we're on our short trip to Portugal. Pretty easy to manage because although guidebooks will tell you you have to go to special confeitarias and stand in queues, there are pretty delicious ones available at stands all over the place, and even passable ones in the supermarkets. These are often, as in Spain, branches of a famous French chain, though we hold our nose at the multinational capitalism from time to time for the sake of convenience shopping. Another cultural element in Lisbon is fado, which is the classic way of showing the generalized difference between Portuguese and Spanish culture. Spanish friends told me they loved Portugal, but the people are sad. We're not really getting that, and I've been in much more sombre cultures, but perhaps they're less dramatic than the average Latino. However, stick fado next to the driving energetic rhythms of flamenco, and you'd have to acknowledge they're completely different styles. The melancholic, haunting melodies of fado, which means fate, are sometimes said to be connected with women calling for their seafaring menfolk to come home, which is fair enough in a nation that's all about its coastline. However, it's also very connected with the Alfama district on the side of the hill where we were catching the tram, the old Moorish medieval streets which became a centre for émigrés from the colonies, particularly after Brazilian independence in the 1820s. In complete contrast to the earlier Republican birth of the USA, Brazil's post-Napoleonic independence was organised unilaterally by the king, literally the son declaring freedom from the father back home. I have yet to satisfactorily decipher all the shenanigans between Portugal and its larger ex-colony, but Brazilians of all hues have been in Portugal for a very long time. In late June, and with 2 days to explore, we figured it would be too hard to find fado away from the Tor torrent, though we occasionally heard lovely string sounds and voices wafting through the upper streets. Lisbon is a very quirky capital because of its shape and its slopes. The famous public funiculars and even a public elevator are all integrated into the transport network, as well as the buses we hopped on. The contours would be lovely if we didn't have a few of those interesting holiday hitches happening. Zoria has a temporary health issue that makes her less of a strident hiker than she might otherwise be, and her suitcase handle has decided to shorten itself dramatically, so that we're hunching up to drag it up hills and over extremely decorative diamond-shaped cobbles that resist suitcase wheels. We do get there in the end, but not before I've left my day bag on a metro bench. Wonderfully, when feeling a bit more spacious the next day, we head up to the lost property station in an outer suburb, and there it is, handed in. Rather more efficient than South Africa, and thankfully less efficient than the UK, where it would probably have been blown up. So, with our peace restored and recognising that Lisbon's slopes are calling us to slow down in a way few other capital cities will do, we go exploring once more. And get trapped in the Tor torrent after all at the Time Out market. What the London listings magazine, Time Out, seems to have done is taken a busy, lively, pre-existing food hall, a grand version of the many we have in Cape Town, one of which has also been conquered by Time Out, and make it more commercial and bland in a thoroughly unnecessary and counterproductive bit of multinational taking over. Boo hiss. We wondered whether anyone eating there was actually Portuguese anymore, which was a little eerie. The fish was good, but honestly not as good as our second night when we sought out a lovely back street restaurant with Benfica soccer club tops on display and Portuguese telly on in the background. That seems itself very quaint, sharing top tips on current museum exhibitions and leaning into very regional culture by doing road shows in different small towns across the country to catch up on local stories of interest. Sounds lovely and worthy and fitting for a small enough country, around the size of our province of KwaZulu-Natal, which the Portuguese were the first to call Natal a long time ago at Christmas, and with a slightly less dense population, where people can at least make a decent pretense at being all in it together without being on top of each other. There are seagulls here and we can smell salt. It's good to be back at the coast, and the fish is fresher than you'll get in most big cities. Indeed, when people talk about the past and Portugal's maritime empire, that's really what Portugal was. All that gold and colonialism could feel a little theoretical in the inland Spanish zones I've been to, and even at Jimena I could see the sea but not jump in it. Here, there's an enormous sculpture of a caravel with images of all the nation's favourite pirate colonial bastards, global discoverers, and a big map of the world and where they travelled. That includes the Cape, for we have a reconstructed caravel on display just down the road in the Cape in Mossel Bay, where the Portuguese maintained a post office for centuries. Well, a postbox tree kind of thing. Anyway, Diaz came round there, beyond the other bay they'd already labelled Saldanha, pronounced incorrectly since then by generations of Cape locals. He stuck lots of Catholic crosses all over the African coastline, or something like that. Here in Lisbon we also see Vasco da Gama's actual tomb in a church here by the waterfront, which is marginally more tasteful than Columbus's in Seville. The stories of the risks these guys took is certainly worth remembering, whatever their general behaviour to natives and the later economic and cultural impacts, kind of Viking Bastards 2.0. And remember them we do, in suburbs like the one round the corner from me, where little boats are pulled up in Marina da Gama, or elsewhere nearby quaint names like Caravel Street or Corsair Close, which is a bit more on the money. Ho-hum. So, we South Africans probably view the whole thing with a little more irony than your average European, who might just see the sign for the Treaty of Lisbon with presidential signatures from the whole European Union. That's outside the gorgeous Renaissance Hieronymite monastery, near the port where the ships would come in, and where the king, who received all the bounty of the Portuguese trade at gunpoint in the east, had agreed to reconstruct the site. King Manuel gave his name to a distinctive style that centres really viscerally on thick rope formations in architecture. There's no pretence at anything other than glorification of the sea trade, really. Sumptuous, opulent, and surprising, given that the monks here, exactly like at El Escorial, Philip II's palace monastery outside Madrid, were keen to revere Saint Jerome, for the Geronimos, were not followers of the famous Apache leader and Wild West movie cliché, but of the Egyptian desert father hermit, who I know more because he tamed a lion and took a thorn out of his foot than anything else. A lovely naive story to tell kids in grade 2 at our Steiner schools. Famous within Christianity for renouncing everything and only agreeing to be more than a hermit when he was repeatedly pestered by potential followers, which I imagine rather like Brian's experience in the movie, though more spiritually pure, obviously. Anyway, here we go again, kings making the most of their ill-gotten gains to promote the most pious of the pious. In the old refectory there's a whole series of biblical stories told in a few lovely Enlightenment-era azulejos. It's a secular state building these days, which is why something as blandly bureaucratic as the Treaty of Lisbon could happen here, I guess, and why we can take selfies on the balconies. The previous religious buildings here were under different management. That of the Order of Christ, the successor organisation to the Knights Templar, who were burned famously in France, but remained rather popular here in crusading Portugal. It's almost as if all that crusading energy had to go somewhere, and Prince Henry the Navigator knew where to channel it somewhere new, now that those foreign heretics had been successfully massacred and evicted from here in the name of piety. The county, and then independent kingdom, of Portugal was originally based further north on the two banks of the Douro River, and the capture of Lisbon from the Arabic rulers was the only great success of the Second Crusade in the 12th century, accompanied, according to written accounts, by the usual completely barbaric behaviour on the part of the knights involved. This bloody history was something we see in reverse, of course, in a Porto church, dedicated to St. Francis, though with Templar crosses all over the place, intriguingly. An intricate altarpiece in one of the chapels, showing peaceful Franciscans getting speared by Egyptians they were trying to convert, though also a rather squat, medieval-style sculpture of Francis himself dating from the 13th century, which is extraordinary because that's not long after he was alive and preaching. We'd previously visited another Baroque church in Lisbon, which was likewise full of intense detail and dedicated to St. Roch, he of the plague victims, which a big city like Lisbon was full of from time to time. If I'd enjoyed plenty of medieval things in Spain, here in Portugal we were mostly being treated to the ridiculous detail of the Baroque. In Lisbon, at least, this is because pretty much the whole city dates from after 1755, the biggest earthquake in recorded European history, and perhaps a fitting way to crash an empire if you're a vengeful god, which the Christian God isn't supposed to be, but never mind. In the Porto church there is also a tree of Jesse, a kind of visual version of A begat B begat C begat D, featuring, as Zoria is quick to point out, very few of the actual birthing mothers along the way and a lot more of the menfolk mentioned in the Bible. But Anna and her daughter Mary do get a look in, sometimes even in pride of place. It's an exquisite bit of craftsmanship from the days when workshops were really enjoying this way of playing with the human form and its relationship to the vegetable, or the mineral stalactites, in a more organic way than the exquisite mudéjar geometric forms I'd seen in Andalusia. I still think the elaborate artistic cultures of the Americas had a lot to do with where Spanish and Portuguese artists went in these centuries stylistically, even if the tree of Jesse as an idea predates the voyagers. Catholic Christianity is still very definitely the top dog religion around here, and we were told of little local rituals involving priests blessing your house in return for a little tip or two on festive occasions. But the nice thing we both liked about churches was, even if you don't know much of their particular faith, they can be cool, peaceful places for taking a breath and connecting with spirit. Francis is shown a few times lifting up the crucified Jesus. There's a sculpture of Saint Isabella too, the queen who prevented war a few times in her reign, and I find myself in tears looking at it. Something bubbling up unexpressed, whether from the atmosphere here or called up from other lives or deep in the soul. There are stories in the letters in the nearby archives too, of Franciscans from Brazil and other colonies writing to hope for a welcome when they arrive here. Many of these orders were attuned to international travellers. That's maybe why we keep feeling so welcome in their churches. Portuguese Catholicism does seem to be a little less showy than in southern Spain. Some of Lisbon's churches look pretty unimpressive from the outside, almost hiding the majesty within. They reminded me strangely of the Greek Orthodox cathedral in mostly Muslim Istanbul. But in Porto, some of the churches have in recent centuries decorated their potentially bland outsides with wonderful azulejos, which suddenly recalled to me places I'd seen them on churches in Puebla, that Catholic ceramic capital of old Mexico. Here there are whole walls full of scenes, visible from the outside whatever the weather. Porto's cathedral is likewise covered in them. This is the magic of these more industrial-era tiles. They preserve their images so much better than, say, the medieval tapestries I'd looked at in Spain, or indeed the world's oil paintings that teams of restorers have to keep working with. There are colourful modern ones by the metro station near our dwelling. The most impressive tiles are, however, covering the walls at São Bento station and telling Portuguese history. At least as many people are coming to look at the images as to catch trains. We are in the north after a shortish, fast and straightforward train trip from Lisbon through this slender and well-forested land, arriving with amazing vistas in this double city of two slopes, both down to the river. Another Iberian place where artisan regional varieties of fish, meat, cheese and booze are waiting to be sampled, including the bird the English call turkey, which in French is called dinde, from India, in common with many other European names for it, and in Portuguese is called with much greater geographic accuracy peru. The local food market has a few signs of tourist weariness, like no photos. The tourists are continual here now. We are lucky enough to have family willing to host us here who can share how the city is changing, suddenly on the northern European map and increasingly the global one. One of their favourite local restaurants has recently been inundated with Korean tourists thanks to a favourable review in a Korean guidebook. I imagine the strange flows and eddies of this expanding tourist river as I'm gazing down at the actual river from the incredible height of the tram bridge over it. Porto is bustling with life on this sunny day. Down at the Ribeira there are Brazilian musicians singing samba and overflowing cafes gazing out at the banks. We've passed a wrought iron marketplace, given new life with a series of millennial entrepreneurs at their stands, all sweetly established in 2024, with original variations on Portuguese cultural themes, earrings and cotton shirts and other things my daughter is keen to take time looking over. We've gazed over the town, where beautiful but run-down buildings are being turned into chic apartments, though the roofs of others are still full of holes. Porto is on the up once more. A Sunday experience, wandering around a lovely old park or two with peacocks in the trees and a concert venue straight out of Close Encounters. Hearing a local saxophonist blasting out a range of impressive genres by a classic bandstand under the shady trees. Eating fish and chips, Portuguese style, at the coast, and having at last my first sea swim in the warmish waters on this side of the Atlantic. We've had long, warm evenings of engaging conversation in the lush back garden of our hosts, with flowers and cats and the soft smells of summer. The whole of Portugal is a lot more temperate and manageable, it seems, than the equivalent latitudes of Spain, with the fresh winds off the coast making it very pleasant. One of Porto's previous up moments came thanks to the British and the infamous oldest alliance in the world between England and Portugal, which is marked in Porto with a big politically incorrect sculpture of the English lion crushing the French eagle, dating to the time the Bonapartes were kicked out with British help. This alliance came in handy for Porto because the local fortified wine could reach the south coast of England without going off, whenever French stuff was off limits because of war, and as we wander we see the warehouses and old customs offices from the heights above, many of which have unexpectedly English names. Atlantica has been a thing in the collective consciousness for a fair while, it seems. There are lines of energy sweeping down the Douro and out towards the wilder north. For today, though, there's tranquillity and human warmth. For many reasons I'm delighted that we've been here, not least because of Mike and Lenka's enthusiastic willingness to host us and connect, though it's been too short, and the other possibilities of this country, beyond its two biggest cities, though delving more into them again, are inviting. The forests of the north of the country hide many stories, and it would probably take a pilgrim's steps to reveal some of them. Instead, we board a bus and get glimpses through the canopies. But we will be back. Pilgrims in reverse. Galicia to Asturias. It's a little disorienting. Outside one of the holiest cathedrals in Christendom, here in the north of Spain, there's a bagpiper playing what I'm assured is local folk music to welcome particularly joyous and exhausted pilgrims of varying natures. We've walked past him and on to find our second meal, via a couple dancing daring salsa in pink, and a beggar who is taking time out to look at his smartphone. We wonder whether he was actually a middle-class pilgrim who didn't quite budget for the trip. Zoria is having some delicious tortilla with orange juice, as she generally avoids alcohol, a definite Gen Z virtue. I can't quite say the same, though I do like the 0% beer that I can once again get now I'm getting a second taste of Spain, here in Galicia, and in particular in Santiago de Compostela. So, a recap of this expedition and a little history lesson. 5 countries, of which I've been in 2 so far these last weeks, and Zoria has had a taste of 1 so far and has just crossed the border overland for her first time ever. As a smallish country, relatively empty of humans and rich in greenery, with a recently rather poor and definitely very Catholic past, Portugal has a lot in common perhaps with that other plucky minnow I'm going to visit, rather than to eat, as seems very popular here on the west coast of Iberia. Ireland, whose capital is nearly as far west as Lisbon. But to digress for a bit, perhaps Portugal also has things in common with Scotland, which once had its own plans to become an Atlantic empire. The Darien scheme was remarkable not for being a disastrous attempt at buying up American colonies. The French did well at that too, buying a swamp, calling it Louisiana, and creating the first paper money in Europe to account for the subsequent royal debt. But for extinguishing a state. The Scottish Parliament in 1700 decided to buy marshland in Panama, and when it came to a lot less than nothing, the MPs abolished themselves and gave the country to England, thus causing the United Kingdom. Their kings had already become kings of England too, so this was the next step, though modern Scots, in favour of independence and trying to efface their own role in the British Empire, might try and avoid this part of the story. Portugal had its own moment of being ruled jointly with Spain for 60 years from 1580, but this was rather more imposed, like English kings had long wanted to do to Scotland but never quite managed of their own accord. The Spanish court was thrown out by Portuguese nobility in the end. What this shows me in fact is the remarkable power of the Spanish court in their golden age. Portugal was probably the second most powerful and wealthy state in Europe and perhaps the world at the time, and yet the Spanish managed to conquer them too for a while. Audacity! And I understand why the Portuguese like to remind everyone how different they are, even if there are plenty of things in common, like a history of tone-deaf global conquest and the slave trade. What does any of this have to do with Galicia, the Spanish province we have entered? Well, to move from history to linguistics, the Galicians have an ancient and often mythical connection to other western edges of the Atlantic world. It's not a million miles, etymologically speaking, from Galicia to Gaelic, the Celtic peoples of Ireland and Scotland, via Gaul, who we all know were those Celts that didn't quite resist the Romans apart from a small village of pagan superheroes, or alternatively Bretons. Medieval Irish histories regularly claimed that the Galicians were the ancestors of the current inhabitants of their island. This may have been conjecture, but clearly they came from somewhere. Although no Celtic languages remain today in Spain, there are things like the Galician bagpipes, which I think are pretty authentic, and the Galician tartan on sale to tourists in Santiago, which I think is about as inauthentic as most of the other clan tartans that the canny Scots invented for Victorians seeking a romantic past. The westernmost edge of Galicia is known as Finisterre, while the westernmost edge of the equally Gallic Brittany is known as Finisterre, both of which mean Land's End, which is coincidentally the name of the western edge of Celtic Cornwall. Oh, and the French call Celtic Wales the country of Gauls, and G becomes W when you hop over the channel. And Portugal broke away from Galicia, and the Gaul bit may well be related to it. Confusingly, the Galicians do have their own recognised regional language though, but it's kind of somewhere between Portuguese and Spanish, nothing to do with the Celts. Once upon a time, the northern part of Portugal was a region of Galicia, under the kingdoms of Leon or Asturias, and when it became an independent kingdom it was as part of a patchwork of medieval Christian states that came and went in northern Spain, while a caliphate based in the south remained strong over much of the country. Following the ins and outs of this medieval Iberian world is a bit beyond me, but I can say that when I've come across it, the fact that there are some kings of proper weird names like Alfonso or Ferdinand makes me much happier than all those Charles and Philips that come later. Our visit to Santiago began with a view over the city centre and its glorious spires from the park nearby. Greenery, peace, plane trees and fresh air, where we also noticed a young black Spaniard in deep conversation with an elderly white one, while partaking in what smelt like not an entirely legal substance, though Spain is notably relaxed about such things, nearly as relaxed as South Africa. However, we had an earnest mission to head on, which was into the medieval core and in search of a little something to eat. There are images everywhere of scallop shells, the symbol of the Camino. If I'm on a pilgrimage, it's not to the end of the world round here, the aforementioned Finisterre, which was indeed and is becoming again a site of pagan pilgrimage, to where the sun sets, nor to where the Apostle James, the brother of Jesus, is said to be buried, though we are heading into the cathedral. The journey is more important, perhaps, than the many destinations. We wouldn't be the first secular pilgrims, though I think that walking with purpose and intention is bound to be a spiritual act. In this case, though, Santiago is actually, curiously, the first place where we will step away from public transport and into driving a car. A different kind of pilgrimage indeed. But we will see plenty of images of scallops on our journey through the north, and even eat one as a pincho in San Sebastian, and later in France I will be reminded that the French call scallops Saint-Jacques, definitely the biggest shellfish around here. In simpler times it was something that pilgrims were given to prove they'd reached Santiago, and maybe even earlier to prove they'd reached Finisterre. The discovery of the apostles' remains and confirmation by the local bishop caused King Alfonso II of Asturias to become the first pilgrim into neighbouring Galicia, and having driven up into the hills between the two regions, I'm definitely tempted to try the Camino Primitivo one day, from Asturias' capital, Oviedo. We will, however, be driving in reverse for a while along the rather more popular route from France, which is where the bulk of medieval and modern pilgrims would come from, thus allowing for plenty of interesting entrepreneurial opportunism along the way. Santiago's cathedral, apart from being one of Christendom's holiest sites, is rather fabulous, continually in use, and an easy place for sitting and tuning in. Brilliantly coloured columns and outrageously large gold angels above the altar. Zoria is rather keener on this than on the Tree of Jesse we get to see with our special extra ticket, although I am definitely impressed by Master Matteo's work there, and indeed by the whole range of medieval industrial workshops creating wonderful pieces for Santiago. While looking at it, I remember the episode set on the Camino in Ken Follett's bestseller The Pillars of the Earth, which does its best to bring those medieval stonemasons to life. A lot of Matteo's work is based around reimagining round Romanesque arches as opportunities for a spectral range of faces and forms. I am intrigued by the 24 musicians of the Apocalypse, who are rather less well known than their equestrian friends, and amused at the gory demons punishing sinners. Elsewhere there are priests earnestly hearing confession in various languages. The cathedral has been through regular and continuous upgrades, particularly in the Baroque period, which is why the neighbouring museum is also rather important. It shows off some of the work that was taken out during improvements, including one lovely wooden piece from a workshop in Nottingham, which gives an idea of how far and wide the importance of this place extended back in the day. When we later visit the Gothic cathedral in León, we learn how these improvements sometimes got ahead of themselves. The extra Baroque stuff that was added unnecessarily there almost caused the whole structure to collapse. Thankfully, 19th century rescue and restoration work returned that cathedral to its former glory. We both really enjoyed León Cathedral, which is apparently the most French Gothic Spanish cathedral. Really elegant, including all the vegetable detail in the stained glass windows. We sat and had supper outside it in the square. Definitely not the cheapest meal I've ever had, and it was pasta, which isn't exactly a traditional Spanish dish, but it was worth it. When I was in my early 20s, a girlfriend and I saved money in a cafe in St. Mark's Square in Venice by drinking it inside. It was only then that we realised the whole point was to pay the premium and sit in the square with the pigeons. I wasn't going to make the same mistake this time around. The Gothic version of León's cathedral began in the reign of Alfonso IX. There were a lot of Alfonsos fighting among themselves and against the Moors. He united Leon and Castile and was already also king of Galicia. Ironically, Castile-Leon, the massive region we've entered, which would become the powerhouse of the emerging Spanish state, was created because Alfonso used Muslim troops to defeat Castile and got excommunicated in the process. In some ways, he's like a much cleverer version of the only English king to get excommunicated and care about it, John. To help him against the Portuguese and the Castilians, Alfonso was also proactive and called the first parliament on mainland Europe, the Cortes of Leon. John's nobles would later force him to call them too, in all that stuff about the Magna Carta that the English have been going on about being the mother of parliaments, etc. ever since. But here we are in what is these days a minor Spanish city. Very pretty and all, like so many. We wander the evening squares and then get a wonderful view over a particularly lively one from our empty-ish hotel. Particularly with the challenges of our currency, I've prepared for this trip when necessary with bargain hunting for accommodation. Yet it's obvious that traditional hotels like this one both employ plenty of well-trained people and are struggling with the quiet anonymity of Airbnb. I'm not sure quite what the solution is, but it would be a shame if a stylish location like this didn't continue to be available. One of the wonderful things Spain and Portugal have done for their national stately homes and many other historic buildings is turn them into national networks of paradors, which are open to the public to pop in and nose around, but also open to making money on tourists who actually stay there. I do get a sense along the way that there are other regions of the internet worth sniffing out that Airbnb and Booking.com just don't get to. If the Christian history of the North is pretty florid, the warrior history was ongoing. All these Orders of Knights clubs, which the Spanish here no doubt gave as an idea to the crusading states in the East, and plenty of arguments and battlements along the way. Going right back to those Roman bastards again. On the way to Leon, we drove round the thick Roman walls of Lugo, for example, and, nearby, a Templar castle that looks straight out of the movies. However, our major stopping point had been in Astorga, close to Leon, and, like it, very much on the main Camino route. We saw lots of pilgrims coming the other way as we drove here from Santiago, sometimes right beside quite major highways, which was not quite my idea of a nice day's hike. There's a Gothic cathedral in Astorga too, but even more interesting is the bishop's house next door, because this was the first of the 3 buildings designed by Antoni Gaudi in the northwest of Spain. And since we are Gaudi fans, unlike Picasso, who bitched about him, we end up seeing all 3. We arrive a few minutes before the post-siesta opening. Some Bolivian visitors, also waiting, are dancing to panpipe music outside. The Bishop's Palace is another kind of upgrade on the church cathedral theme for the late 19th century. Disney-style slate cone turrets, super elegant neo-Gothic arches made with the addition of ceramics, bright Art Nouveau colours in the stylish chapel. All possible as a rebuild after some bombing in the Napoleonic Wars, something we learn via a fun but frivolous virtual reality headset variation on the usual museum documentary. We loved it, and we loved the Capriccio Gaudi built in Comillas even more. Home for a lawyer friend, and with so many modern design features built in. Such an elegant use of space, as well as examples of ergonomic wooden furniture that was way ahead of its time. It's like he took Iberian ceramics to the next level of artistry, making each cell integral to the whole and also integrating the house into nature. His other building, we don't go inside, but it's in central Leon and features Michael crushing a dramatic dragon on the outside. Nearby is another sculpture of a lion crawling out of a manhole, and a bust of Alfonso II, who conquered the city in the 900s, i.e. very long ago, perhaps before heading off to Santiago to start the trend. On another occasion I would have suggested we stopped more in the countryside than we did. We've been given a free upgrade by the car hire company, in other words a larger car than I asked for because the small ones are all taken. Since I'm driving on the wrong side of the road for the first time in a couple of years, that's a little hair-raising, especially in this territory which is hilly, often forested, full of tunnels and viaducts on the freeway and full of bends on the minor roads. Castile-Leon is classic hot, dry Spanish plain, with red tile roofs and quiet, empty villages. We head further north from here, though, into Asturias and via the hills of the Somiedo River. There are picturesque dam views, soft mountain ascents, and cows in the mist, which are a must-stop moment for Zoria, who hasn't heard real cowbells before apart from on her drum kit. The descent is lush and cool. We are suddenly in a very different region, almost like the passes into the garden route from the Karoo. Except this lush land is really extensive, much broader than our southern Cape. Spain seems to be fairly large and empty of humans, in fact, and given many strangely quiet villages, there's often not much traffic en route. The roads are good, so driving is fairly gentle on this South African's soul. We stop for a picnic beside a stream and look at the vegetation, which is unfamiliar to me. The last time I was in Europe I didn't much care for the distinctions between species, but I'm more observant and intrigued these days, wondering what I'm seeing and what to look out for. There are bears in this region which we don't see. There's a chance Zoria spotted a grey Iberian wolf as we drove past some dense woodland. We stop for petrol, and the shop attendant comes out to actually operate the pump, something South Africans kind of expect, but is a little surprising in this part of the world, especially as I saw Raquel operate her own car wash a couple of weeks ago, and I was assuming self-service was standard, and it's definitely not what I'll experience further north. There's thick mist as we pull into the quaint fishing village of Cudiero, but as we descend in the drizzle, our breath is taken by the view of the North Atlantic and the delightful little bay we're staying in for the night. Cars can't get anywhere near it, so this is all on foot through warrens that need various checks of the GPS before we can identify and let ourselves into our apartment. We wander down when the rain clears to look at the ocean, as well as at an elderly woman swimming lengths across the harbour, before taking in an early evening drink. I buy some cheese and some free-range eggs for the morning. With our Porto family we tried intense goat cheese from the Azores, runny sheep cheese that you dip a teaspoon into, and cow cheese with pieces of truffle, so I am ready for the next sequence of taste sensations, and the mild climate of Asturias doesn't disappoint. At one of our stops there's a whole manual on what to look for as regional products. These include a tasty bean stew, which I try, but confusingly for Zoria, not the paella she's expecting in Spain, which is actually from the East Coast rather than being a national dish. The one she tries is rather disappointing, perhaps predictably. I do have my own intriguing disappointment in Cudiero, however. That morning, passing one of those generic Irish pubs that are all over Europe and indeed parts of South Africa, we burst out into what we remember of Molly Malone, and now there's cockles on the menu. Weeks later in Dublin I passed the recent busty statue of the fictional trader, which is about as superficially interesting as the cockles themselves. They turn out to be tiny, very expensive, and rather bland, so luckily not our only dish. I also tried the local cider, which experienced waiters will pour for you in a cascade from the bottle to get the bubbles operating. Real cloudy stuff, which Zoria thinks is far too medicinal tasting to be interesting, even if it's marketed as good for you. There's a lot more to see in Asturias than we have time for. We avoid the big cities of Oviedo and Gijón, even if they have early medieval churches and things, in favour of a trip into the Picos de Europa, the first peaks the sailors would see on their return to Europe. These are the first place where I get memories of childhood holidays, for Cangas de Onís has the upmarket bustle I remember from mountain resorts in France and Germany. And nearby Covadonga is absolutely packed with tourists, many of them presumably Catholic, as we approach the gorgeous basilica in the Kloof, and more importantly the statue of the Virgin in a cave, where she inspired the first victory against the Moors in the 8th century, leading to the foundation of the first little Christian kingdom of the centuries-long Reconquista, with the first of the northern Spanish Alfonsos on the throne. It looks very picturesque, but instead we stop by another gorgeous mountain stream for our sandwiches. That afternoon we make it to Llanes, another very pretty little seaside town, where we get our first Spanish swim in, and eat rich free-range ice cream in the flavour of a local sweet, turrón. There we stay in an ancient but surprisingly reasonable inn known as the Posada del Rey, because no less a monarch than Charles V got lost and stayed here for a few nights back in the day. It's raining again that evening, but a warm rain, with other people eating ice cream, wearing shorts and holding umbrellas in the street. The kind of summer they have round here is not what I've been led to expect of Spain, but that makes it all the more charming. And there's still a few more Spanish adventures awaiting us. So, thank you for listening to this latest episode in the series, and you can find all of my articles and my recordings at lucidfringe.substack.com, except my music and poetry from the past, which is all available at simrickyarrow, all one word, .bandcamp.com, and the background recordings and sounds that you will have heard are all either from those recordings or they are my own. Please do give this a rating if it's on your podcast app. Please spread the word if you enjoy what you hear, and if you want to give me some feedback or commentary, of course I'm very open to that. Any suggestions for future episodes? Okay, enjoy. See you next time. Ravings from the Lucid Fringe. Ravings from the